My name is Kelsey O'Shea. I am the Farm Business Management Specialist for Cornell Cooperative Extension's North Country Regional Ag Team. I like to tell people that my job is to help farmers with everything that's not actually farming. So whether it be HR or finances or accounting or employee management or generational transfer like we're going to talk about today, those are the topics that I focus on with farm clients. As part of a grant through the Adirondack North Country Association, I am working on a project called the Center for Business in Transition. Part of that is talking with experts about their experience with farm clients regarding generational transfer. So to start us off for today, we have Mark Modulewski joining us, and I will let Mark introduce himself and tell a little bit about what he does. So Mark, take it away.
Hi, Kelsey. Thanks very much. I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you and work with Cornell. I'll give you a little bit of background on who we are. I started in the financial services industry about 20 years ago. Over that time frame, we had done everything from consulting with individuals and families and small businesses up to medium and large size businesses. 15 or so years ago, we had made a commitment to focus our practice on agriculture. So much of our practice is designed and organized to support those in the ag or ag-related industries. And the vast majority of our work is done in the Northeast and in particular in New York. I'm lucky enough to be part of two organizations. One is Legacy Wealth Advisors of New York, and myself and our team offer generic financial planning services for individuals and businesses. We do insurance, managed money, and employee benefits. And then we do some consulting. And much of our consulting nowadays goes through a company called Gateway Consulting and Coaching. And I have another partner there by the name of Lisa Sears. And between those two companies, we often will partner with businesses to help them through things such as transfer, HR issues, as well as how do they set their businesses up to be most profitable.
Awesome. That sounds super relevant to the conversation that we're going to have today. So I'm excited for us to jump right in. So, to give all of our listeners out there an idea, we're going to go through probably 5 or 6 questions with Mark. These were developed through conversations with my farm clients about what they would most want to know from experts like Mark, consultants, that sort of stuff before they jump in, perhaps to using their services or jump into working on their own generational transfer plan. So the first thing I'm going to ask you, Mark, is what are the top 3 questions that people ask about business transfer or generational transfer? What are those top 3 burning things that when they get to you, they say, how do we do this? Or what does this mean? Or where do I go? What does that look like for you?
Yeah, I think it's pretty interesting. I think I would break that question into 2 different areas. What generally would be the 3 questions that the family business that we're working with has in their head, and then what are the 3 or 4 questions that I may have for them when they approach this topic of generational transfer or transition? I'd say their questions revolve around how do we do it? How do we make the money work? And what if this doesn't work? What if the next generation just doesn't have the ability or capacity to make it work? Or if the industry is changing so much that maybe it's just not a viable business? I think the questions that we would want them to ask is what does transfer really mean to them? Is it just a change of ownership? Is it a change of day-to-day operations? How are you prepared, or are you prepared for a change in roles and responsibilities? The second question I would think that they would want to ask is, are we really ready for change and transfer? So oftentimes people will say we need to transfer our business, but when you get into the weeds on what they're trying to accomplish, they really don't want to transfer all of the quote unquote say or the control. They want to make sure that they are engaging that next generation to stay interested. And then thirdly, I would say the question that I would ask them is, are you set up for change? And that I think is twofold. One is, are you set up from a structure standpoint to make it easy to change based on whatever your goals are? And then two is, are you set up for change with your management structure, standard operating procedures, et cetera? I think what ends up happening is people get this idea of what generational transfer is or what it's supposed to be, but they don't really think about the end. What is the end? What do they really want to accomplish? And I often ask people if they understand the difference between true succession, transfer, continuity, and inheritance. And what I mean by that is the idea of, if I want to succeed my father or mother in running this farm, what does that look like compared to if mom and dad are willing to transfer a portion of the business or all of the business to that next generation? And then compared to continuity, which means there's something that happened on the farm that forces us to deal with an issue that we knew we were going to have to deal with at some point, where somebody leaves or somebody gets sick or somebody gets divorced or somebody gets hurt. And then that last one is this whole idea of inheritance, where I work on the family farm and eventually this will all be mine. And what does that really mean? And I think those are really broken down into two main areas, which is, how do we transfer the value? And then how do we transfer the roles and responsibilities? And those are two very different questions. And ultimately, it comes down to leadership and mentorship. So if I had, that was a long-winded answer to your question, but I think those three questions that they have are, how do we do it? What about the money? And what if it doesn't work? And what we really want them to start thinking about is all this other stuff around it. You know, are you really ready for change? And help me define what change really looks like.
That's awesome. And I'm really grateful that you went over what people and what farms are saying to you versus maybe what you think the intent or some of the backstory behind what's being said is. Because sometimes it's hard for us as individuals to articulate more of the emotional side of it, which it sounds like that's kind of what you delve into. We want to get hung up on the structural, but there's so much more complexity than just this money is going to go here on this date and then you're in charge.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think the structural transition from ownership in the corporation or the partnership or the LLC is generally a relatively easy exercise. You know, you're going to gather a team of smart people together, and they're going to walk through the pros and cons on how to move ownership from one person to another. The thing that's more difficult is, how do you deal with the financial impact, the money, and then how do you deal with the leadership, which is the roles and responsibilities. So I agree with you. I think that most people are focused on structural change, which is probably the easiest part of generational transfer.
Got it. So, with all of that and discussing what clients have asked you for versus, what questions you follow up with them, what is one of your favorite resources to point people at after you've had this initial conversation of, we want to start transfer, we're starting this process? Where do you send people? Is it a print resource, a video, a sit down meeting? Where do people go first?
I think it's an interesting way to phrase that question. Um, I think there's lots of resources out there. I think folks like Cornell, Pro Dairy, corn and soybean growers, a lot of the organizations and institutions around the country have some really great resources and articles dealing with generational transfer. It's been, for the last 20 years, it seems like it's been the hot topic. So it's really easy to find literature on how to make that happen. Much of that literature, I think, is organized in one of two ways, where they're talking about operational transition or they're talking about structural transition. And when people ask us what the next step is, we would generally tell them that we need to put together a team, and that team is usually going to be an accountant, or a CPA, someone that they trust. They may be working with them, or it may be somebody separate. That person that has a unique ability to understand not only their situation, but the agricultural situation that they're in from a tax standpoint. We'll also try to work and encourage them to find an attorney who has some focus in generational transfer, particular in agriculture. And there are a half a dozen folks that we partner with in the state that do an awesome job. We will often talk to other financial folks or other business consultants. And sometimes those consultants will um, share opportunities to work on different pieces. So, for example, they may be very good at projections. They may be very good at cost and efficiencies, things that other people on the team can do, but the consultant is in the best place to make that happen. And then we will often try to get engaged with some sort of coach to talk about leadership and structure. In other words, what is the culture of our farm? I think it's important to realize that everybody believes that their farm has a great culture, and that they have great processes and that people are happy to be there. When you do a generational transfer, I think it's important that as you build these resources, one of the resources that you invest in is, how does our culture really work? What is our culture? Where are we strong and where are we weak? Because you would hate to do all of this work to move it over only to find out that the things that are making it difficult to transition have nothing to do with structure or finances. They have to do with people. Often, when we start driving people towards resources, we try to make them think through three areas of transition and through structural ownership. One is management. So, when you have this generational transfer, what does the current management structure work? What does it look like? How does it work? What are the roles and responsibilities? After this generational transfer, what will those three things look like? Um, how do we work day to day? Who makes decisions? Will some of those responsibilities be changing? The second one is the financial part of the stool. So after this transition, we need to find resources that'll help us understand, how do the finances work? What can we afford to pay? What can we afford to keep? What are the things that we should inherit and what are the things that we should buy, or what are the things that we should be given or gifted? And then lastly, we want to talk about the operation. We need to build resources around, is our operation as efficient as possible? So if you think about building resources with regard to, how do we manage our current operation, what are the finances of our current operation, and how do we operate day to day, I think that it's not just the traditional, let me find an article on how do I move my business to my son or daughter, but moreover, it's very specifically trying to put them in a position to succeed. So we need to identify resources that will give them opportunities in each one of those areas. And like I said before, I think that means partnering with a really good accountant, a really good attorney, a really good planner, and a really good business consultant.
Wow, that's great. So there's not definitely not just one resource, but it's this team of resources that you start to assemble. And I think that's great advice for people. With that being said, after listening to you talk about that, it sounds like there's quite a few moving pieces going on in these types of transfers. And with every moving piece, I could see that there would be an opportunity maybe to make a wrong turn, right? To hit a roadblock. So, with these different moving pieces and with what you've seen with your clients, where do you see people stumble first or hit a roadblock, maybe make a wrong turn?
Interesting that you phrased the question that way. This morning, I was on a call with my partner on our consulting and coaching firm, and one of the things that she said to me is that we had run this webinar for women business owners, and the idea behind it was how do they get to a position where they can feel empowered to lead. And she said that she was a bit challenged in the fact that some of them came back afterwards and said, "Can we hire you to give that same speech to our organization?" And it was the total opposite of what we really wanted to have happen. What we wanted to have happen was build the expectation that we're going to work on this together, but then ultimately you're going to do it. So the stumbling block piece, I think, really comes when you start deciding what do we really want to get out of this process, and what are the expectations from this process. So it's not uncommon for 2 or 3 generations to get into a room and the stumbling block be that generation one and generation two and generation three are thinking about intergenerational transfer very differently. So being on the same page, I think, is by far the most important thing prior to figuring out how are we structured and what do our finances look like. We really need to make sure that our goals are aligned. So if the idea is let's transfer this organization over the next 10 years, and we're going to step into financial ownership, management decisions, etc., over that time frame, and everybody's on the same page, it'll go very smoothly. If the second generation is thinking that tomorrow they're going to own the place, and the first generation is saying, "Hey, listen, you're going to own a piece, but we're still going to make decisions together, and I'm going to have final say," that becomes a very big stumbling block. I actually worked on a case in Western New York a couple of years ago, and when I tell you the story, I think you'll understand where I'm coming from. I was talking to generation one, the father, and he said, I really believe that my son is just about ready to take over. He's been doing a good job. His son is now coming into the farm working part-time when he's not in school. And I think he's just about ready to take over the ownership of the operation. And then maybe at some point we can pass on the land. So as we started talking, it was evident that he believes that his son is a good farmer and does have the skills that are necessary to do it. The challenge that I had to share with him is that his son, the generation two, is 55 years old. And his son at 55 is actually relatively depressed over the fact that dad's promised him over the last 20 years that he would have more say. Now, dad believes that the son's ready and he's willing to give it over to him. And the son's ready to say, "I'm not sure I want it anymore because I've been so stressed out over what's going to happen that it's never happened." And then his kids, who are in their 20s, want to come back, but they're still looking at the fact that their 80-year-old grandfather still owns the farm. So
Right.
it's a matter of perspective, right? We all need to be on the same page. And if a long time ago that individual shared with his son that I'm going to own this for a long time, but you're going to eventually control it, maybe things would be different.
Right. That's great insight, and I would completely agree, at least from my small purview as well, that the first misstep is that people aren't on the same page.
Yeah.
We think we're all coming to the same table, maybe from the same place, rowing in the same direction, and it's just that's not the case.
hmm
So with that, how can we avoid that misstep in particular? So how do you see people mitigate that issue that comes up?
So I would say that we would have those in two categories. There's the families that come to us, um, have really good relationships, communicate very well, and they're already at a point where they understand that. And then there are the folks who believe that they communicate well, but in fact they don't communicate very well. And oftentimes we will encourage them to have conversations with us about family culture, company or farm culture, strengths and weaknesses of everybody on the management team. We'll really try to dive into that first. Sometimes it becomes frustrating because people are trying to figure out, how do we transfer ownership, or how do we transfer wealth per se? How do we do estate planning to alleviate transfer tax, etc.? But again, our goal is to make it successful, and we can do all of the tax planning we want. But if at the end of the day it's not successful and the farm fails, then it was all for naught. So we often will encourage them to either work with us, or work with someone else, just to talk through this idea of, what exactly do you want at the end of this? What are the things that you're scared of? What are the things that you think you do really well? What are the things that you think you need to do better? And the other part, Kelsey, that I would also say is that both generations need to understand that as businesses have changed, they may not have someone in their family that has the expertise to do what needs to be done. They may need to hire someone to help them do that. So oftentimes, dad or grandpa started a farm and it grew, and they have a part-time bookkeeper, or mom did the books and dad worked outside, and they want to transition it over to their son or their daughter, but the farm has gotten so big that they need expertise in so many areas, that they don't understand the fact that bringing other good people in will actually help the transition. And I'm part of a couple of them that we're working on now, where the family may not have the talent inside the family to make everything run, and then there's a little bit of a struggle on, how do we find that talent to partner with us. So I think it's just being real with each other, hiring somebody to understand what you do well and what you don't do well, what you're excited about doing and what you're not excited about doing, so that as you're doing this generational planning and you're getting into the weeds over structure and voting interest and loan covenants and all that good stuff, everybody's on the same page. So they all understand, this is my role, this is what I do, this is how the whole farm would be most successful. Because ultimately, the true the true focus on whether this transition is going to be successful is solely based on whether all the parties put the farm first. If the succession of the farm is more important than any individual person, it will succeed. If the financial gain or one individual person is more important than the success of the farm, that transition is going to struggle. It always will, and it always has.
That's a great way of putting it. That was awesome. I wanted to comment as well, listening to you talk, really identifying the difference between management and ownership. And this idea as well that you may have a family member who is going to own it someday, but may not actually manage it, right? Or vice versa, right? You
Mhm.
may have outside non-family people come in who are going to manage it and own it, or not.
Right.
So we've always tied, I feel like farming has always tried to tie those two together, management and ownership. And I think at this point, you're just really describing that it's very much okay to pull those apart.
And it may be best, it may be better to pull those apart for the long-term goal of the sustainability of the organization.
Awesome. So the next question and our last one for this podcast is going to be, what do you see as the best kept secret about generational transfer or family transfer from the perspective of your business in consulting?
I would say, from the consulting side, the best kept secret, and even though it sounds like it's a bit cliche, is a positive, happy, hopeful, joyful culture will always succeed. Um, when we sit with families that tend to be a bit negative or pessimistic, or sometimes they define it as realistic based on milk price or commodity price, or land or regulation or compliance, those folks tend to spend more time focusing on what can stop the plan. And if everybody is on the same page that says we're going to focus on what we need to do to make this succeed, then in fact you will succeed. It has very little to do with money and structure. It has to do with attitude and effort. And if everybody puts in the positive attitude and effort, you'll overcome anything, regardless of what it is. So I think that best kept secret is staying as positive as you can, giving the benefit of the doubt to the folks that you trust that you're going to work with for a long period of time. Be quick to forgive and quick to forget, especially when it comes to family or people that you want to partner with for the next 20 or 30 years. Let the small things go in lieu of the bigger picture. And if you do that with positivity and trust, those farms will go on for a very, very long time.
Wow, that's really cool. I'm intrigued. That's not exactly what I would have expected you to say, but that's great. So I do have one follow-up from that I was thinking about while listening to you talk. How do you sort of put the train back on the tracks, I guess, when let's say you're meeting with a family and you can feel it, right? You can feel it, things are going that negative town direction. How can you advise families, or what advice do you give to families to either check their mindset, reframe the mindset, pull them back into that realm of positive? Is there any one thing you suggest they do, or an exercise that you go through to do that?
You know, probably my partner Lisa is best to answer that question. I'm thinking as you're asking it how to answer it, and I think the way that she would answer that question is it's okay to take a time out. It's okay to refocus on the goals that we set earlier. Why are we doing this? For what purpose? Remember, we're all on the same page because we want this. So for example, in those first couple of meetings, if our focus is to generationally transfer it so it's what's best for the farm and best for the family, when we hit a stumbling block or we start going down a road of negativity, we may stop, take a time out, review why we're actually running down this process, and make sure everybody's still committed to it. And if they are committed to it, just try to help them focus to say, look, let's stay focused on the end goal, because we all know that at the end, when it's done, we're going to be better than we are right now. So I think that's what we would do: refocus on the goals and why we're doing what we're doing.
I've seen too, it's interesting that you say that refocus. Unfortunately, part of what I've seen as a response to either taking that turn kind of to negative town or getting a little off track is a gear change of, well, we were going to do this over time and we were going to do it really stepwise, but clearly, we have different priorities. So let's just sell it. Do you know what I'm saying? Or
Yeah.
accelerate the timeline or move it over, or
Yeah.
push it off and stop completely. And I would be curious to see your thoughts. Is that a valid strategy, or would you recommend not doing that?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. We've had some conversations with some psychologists revolving change, and I actually went to school as a psychology major, which is kind of funny since the majority of my time is based on finance. But this whole psychology of change, most of the time, people are worried over a handful of things. They're worried over control. They're worried over financing, but generally, people, it's difficult for them to make decisions if they're concerned about their health, the health of someone else, or their finances. So oftentimes, when people struggle with this change, or they get to the point where they become very negative, or they're trying to find the reasons why it doesn't work, we may stop that conversation and start focusing with them on why are we here? How did we get to the point where we're derailing things? And I think that comes back to one of the first questions I said, because I think their questions are, how do we do it? What about the money? And what if it doesn't work? And my question is, are you really ready to make this happen? If you're really ready to make this happen, it's going to take compromise and sacrifice. And that means you're going to have to let other people do things that in the past you weren't comfortable letting them do. And if they're not ready, that's okay. You can always step into transfer. It doesn't have to be, hey, we're going to have this conversation and everything's done. So maybe you baby step in there. The other part you need to understand is that at some point, some folks are never ready for generational transfer. And it's not that their farm isn't set up for it. It's just that mentally they have a hard time letting go. And it takes a unique person in that second generation or third generation to be able to partner with them for the good of the farm, or those people move on. And I think sometimes we need to share that with folks that says, if you're really struggling to let go, that's okay. Keep what is always yours. But just understand that there may be some family members that may need to do something else because that's what's best for them. And sometimes that helps them refocus.
That's great advice, and you're absolutely right. And I would close this off too, just by remembering that sometimes no transfer is a success
Right.
still, because it's what was honestly best for the individual. So although many times we are hoping to transfer a business, sometimes a lack thereof, or even just a sale or retirement, is should be viewed equally as successful, because all parties involved will probably end up where they were meant to be.
Yeah, agreed. Agreed.
Well, I really appreciate your time, Mark. And I would love it if you would tell our listeners how they can find you and your company after listening to this. If they think, man, I need to get with Mark and get the ball rolling, how can they get a hold of you?
Well, I appreciate that. Probably the easiest way to do it is just visit our website, which is legacywealthadvisorsny.com. And you'll be able to see part of our team and contact us there.
Awesome. So definitely, if you're listening to this and you're thinking, I'm ready to get started, I need more questions answered, or maybe I'm ready to keep going and need some help getting that done, definitely visit Mark's website. And we really appreciate your time today, Mark. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Kelsey.